Well, hopefully, as you came in today, you kind of noticed in the seats there in front of you little cards, and those cards just let you know that the seat you're sitting in has been prayed for, which means you've been prayed for today. As a staff, our staff over the last several weeks has been looking forward to this day, praying for this day. This is our Response Sunday, and we're praying for you. There a team of people came by this week and prayed for each of the seats in this room, and one of the things that we want to do is we want to be praying about everyone responding to God in a way that is what God is asking them to do. And so if you're in this room or if you're watching today, we want more than anything in the world for you to have had the opportunity to have an encounter with God. And if God is going to come by your seat or God's going to come by wherever you are right now, we want more than anything in the world for you to respond to how God is calling you to respond. And so that could look differently depending on who you are today. But this day is a Response Sunday. Over the last several weeks, we've been praying for and getting ready for this day. And I just want to share with you kind of a short message. We're looking at a passage that we've looked at over the last several weeks. If you're new today, you're a guest here today, you haven't heard this maybe ever, or maybe you've heard it before, it's been a long time. For a lot of the people in the room, you've heard me read this passage again and again and again. It's a story from the Gospel of Luke. It is a story about Jesus who is going to, on his way to Jerusalem, where he would go to the cross and where he would die. And as he's making his way, he stops or he sort of stops in a little town called Jericho, which is one of the lowest places on earth, like literally in terms of elevation. It's in one of the oldest cities in the world. And undoubtedly there were a lot of people that lived in Jericho. But there are two stories in the Bible about individuals who, when they had a brief encounter with a Jesus who was just passing through, responded. They responded in a way that would transform their lives, and in a way that here we are 2,000 years later, we're reading about what happened to them. One of them was a blind man sitting on the side of the road just begging in hopes of just being able to get enough, alms for the poor to get through life. And the other was a man who was not physically blind, but he was physically short, so much so that he couldn't see through a crowd of people, and so he would go up in a tree in order to see Jesus when he would walk by. But both of these individuals' lives would be transformed. In the case of Bartimaeus, he would be healed and be able to physically see and follow Jesus. In the case of this other man, Zacchaeus, his life would be transformed as he gives himself completely to Jesus and makes him Lord of his life and gets right with God in terms of the things of his life. Both of these individuals responded to God in a way that is powerful and life-changing. The title of our message today is called, How Do We Get This Right? Or How Do We Get This Wrong? If God were to say to you today, I want to show up in your life in a powerful and personal way, and God was just waiting on you to respond, how would you get that right, or how would you get that wrong? Well, the story we're going to look at again is in Luke 19. In fact, this story comes just on the heels of the story I just told you about this blind guy named Bartimaeus. It says in chapter 9 of verse 1 of Luke's gospel, Jesus entered Jericho, and he was just passing through. He wasn't going to stay. I mean, if you were going to have an encounter with Jesus, you better make it quick, because he was on his way out of town. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus, and he was a chief tax collector and was wealthy, and he wanted to see who Jesus was. But because he was short and he could not see over the crowd, so he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and he said to him, Zacchaeus, come down, and notice this word, immediately. I must stay at your house Today. It's got to be today. There wasn't another day that this was going to happen. So he came down at once, and he welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this, and they began to mutter, he's gone to be the guest of a sinner. But Zacchaeus stood up, and he said to the Lord, look, Lord, notice what he's calling him, Lord, here and now, not tomorrow, not someday, now, here and now, I give half my possessions to the poor. If I've cheated anybody out of anything, I'll pay back 4 times the amount. And Jesus said to him, today, not tomorrow, not someday, but today, salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. And then Jesus gives us this verse that has become the theme of this entire series. It is the mission of Jesus. It is the purpose of Jesus. In verse 10, he says, for the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. Jesus came to seek and save the lost. Jesus came for people who didn't even know about him, didn't even care about him. He came to rescue and deliver them, but they have to respond to him. Now, you have to respond in the right way. So how do we get this right, or how do we get this wrong? Well, to get this wrong, all we've got to do, based on this story, all you got to do in life is just listen to the wrong people. There are plenty of people who are going to tell us that God doesn't matter, that Jesus doesn't matter, that the Christian faith doesn't matter. There are plenty of people out there that are going to tell us information that isn't true. I've never met someone that didn't have an opinion. I've never met somebody that didn't have an opinion about a lot of things. Most of us have a lot of opinions, but we all can't be right if we contradict each other. And so there has to be something that is true. All we've got to do in order to get this wrong is just listen to the wrong people. So who are the wrong people in this story? In verse 3, we are told that Zacchaeus couldn't see Jesus. What was keeping Zacchaeus from Jesus? There was a crowd in the way. They were the barriers we talked about earlier in the series. They were standing in the way of him coming to Jesus. Not only that, but they were saying stuff like, no, Jesus and Zacchaeus, y'all shouldn't even talk to each other. So all that's necessary to get this wrong in life is listen to the wrong people. Here's the graphic of Zacchaeus up there in the tree, the artist. And you kind of see a big old crowd of people behind. And what Jesus does is Jesus bypasses the crowd and he comes right up to his tree. Jesus is not going to be deterred by the crowd, and Zacchaeus is not going to be deterred by the crowd or the tree. But the text then tells us something else was happening. And that is, it tells us that there was a group of people when they saw what was going to happen, when Jesus was going to go to his house and eat dinner with him. There was a group of people who the text says began to mutter. They began to grumble. They began to complain. The crowd, you could hear them muttering, mutter, 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 mutter. And what were they muttering? They were muttering, how is it that Jesus, this really holy and righteous person, could go into the house of this terrible, sinful person? Why would that actually happen? But what Jesus will reveal in this moment is that is exactly the reason that he came. In fact, this Gospel of Luke will say this over and over again. In the 15th chapter of the Gospel of Luke, there are a series of stories, some of the most famous stories in all of literature. One is a story of a lost coin that a woman lost, and she goes looking for it to find it. Another one is a story of a lost sheep. A shepherd's lost one of his sheep, got to go find it, goes, looks for it, finds it, brings it back, leaves the 99. We sang that today. And then there's another story of a man who loses his son, and he waits patiently for him to come home. There's a lost coin, a lost sheep, a lost son. Now that whole story is written to tell us that God is like the shepherd. He's searching for the lost. He wants to seek and save them. He wants to rescue them. He wants to find them, and he wants to help them. But did you ever notice the reason why Jesus tells those stories? In Luke chapter 15, when Jesus tells those stories, the occasion is the same as what we see here. There's a group of religious people kind of standing around, and they're going, why is Jesus talking to all these sinners? Luke chapter 15, verse 1 and 2, I'll read it to you. It says, now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, in other words, the guys who spent all their life in like religion and religious stuff and religious study, I mean, they knew the Bible really well. The Pharisees, the teachers of the law, what is the word? Say it out loud. What's that word? They what? They muttered. That's the same thing that's happening, isn't it, here in chapter 19? They muttered. They're muttering. They're grumbling. They're, can you believe it? What are they muttering? This quote, this man, they can't even say his name, Jesus. This man welcomes sinners and he eats with them. Do you see what's happening here? These religious people cannot understand the heart of God is to reach people who are lost. The same problem that it was in those days is still a problem in our day. There are crowds and crowds of religious people, church-going people, who do not live their lives with an understanding that God desperately wants to reach the lost, that he desperately wants to find the lost sheep, the lost son, the lost daughter. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus does the same kind of thing, and in the 9th chapter, it says, when the Pharisees saw this, Matthew 9:11, they didn't even ask Jesus, they just asked his disciples, hey, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? And on hearing this, Jesus said, it's not the healthy that need a doctor. I've often thought of it like this. I mean, you don't call 911 when you're feeling great. You call 911 when it's an emergency. We just don't just say, hey, you know what, I'm going to take all this when I don't really need it. It's not the healthy that need a doctor, it's the sick. And when you're sick, you need help. And that's what Jesus is saying that he came to do. But go and learn what it means. And he quotes the Old Testament. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And then he says this, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. I've not come to call people who think that they've got it all together, they've got it all figured out. I've come to call people who know their brokenness. I've come to call people who know their lostness, who know their need for God. I've come for those people. And all we got to do to get this moment wrong is just listen to the wrong people. Just listen to the religious crowd that says, it's all about me. Rick Warren, who of course is a very famous pastor, he's just recently retired in California and wrote, of course, The Purpose-Driven Life. I heard Rick Warren say one time that there are only 2 reasons people are not Christians in the world. One reason is they've never met a Christian. The other reason is they have. Do you understand that joke? That there are people in the world, billions of them, who are living in the world and they have not had the opportunity to hear the good news of Jesus. They've never met a Christian who's introduced them to Christ. But there are also a lot of people who've been around a lot of self-righteous Christians. A lot of Christians who knew their Bibles and knew church and knew religious stuff, but they were nothing like the Jesus we meet in Scripture who loves the lost and wants to help them and save them. All you got to do, if you want to get it wrong, is just listen to the wrong people. Or, here's the other option. Just don't have the right perspective. What we see in this story with the case of Zacchaeus is that he wants to see Jesus. This is a man who is seeking Jesus. Jesus comes to town. He's a sinner, but he wants to see Jesus. But there's a group of people standing in the way, including all these religious people. But there is a way for Zacchaeus to see Jesus. He's got to move out in front of the crowd, along the road, and climb up in the tree. And he's got to do what? He's got to look over the crowd. Now, what that does is it gives him a vantage point that he can look over and he can see Jesus. He just needs, as we would say, a different perspective. If we do not have the right perspective, we will not get this moment right in our lives. We will not respond correctly if we don't have the right perspective. So what did Zacchaeus do? He moved. He moved over, verse 3, and he moved up. Now there is a story in the Bible, perhaps one of the most famous stories in the Bible, in which a man had an encounter with God. In fact, we even call this moment by the name of what he saw when he had his encounter with God. We call it a burning bush moment. You see this graphic here? Who is the man who saw God in the burning bush? Just say it out loud. It was Moses. Moses. Now, I don't know if you know well the story of the life of Moses, but at this moment, Moses sees the burning bush and hears God, meets God. If you had written the biography of his life, it would have been nothing but a tragedy. It would have started out with the fact that when he was born, he almost died. And he was rescued out of the Nile River by the royal family of Egypt. And he was adopted into the royal family, and it looks like he had made it. I mean, he was on his way to becoming this prince of Egypt. And then one day, he couldn't control his temper. He lost it, and he killed a man. Moses the murderer would have been the chapter written about his life at that moment. He's the kind of person you'd see in the nightly news, on the cover of a newspaper. But that's not the end of the story, because he runs away. He flees. He goes out into the desert. He goes to Midian, and he gets married, and he becomes a shepherd. And this is the moment in which Moses meets God. He's in the desert, walking around with a bunch of sheep, and then in the distance, he sees this burning bush. Now, everybody knows this story, but I wonder if you've ever actually noticed what really happens in this story. In Exodus chapter 3, we can put the verses on the screen. It says, "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness. And he came to Horeb." Sometimes we call this Mount Sinai in the Bible, the mountain of God. "There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that the bush was on fire and it did not burn up. So Moses thought, 'I'll go over and see this strange sight.'" So Moses he's out there and he sees this bush burning in the distance, and it just keeps burning. And he's like, "You know what? That's interesting." I mean, you just don't see that every day. There's not a lot of probably cool things to see out in the desert. This is probably about the coolest thing he's ever seen out there. And he says, "You know what? I will go over and see this strange sight. Why the bush does not burn up." At this point in the story, Moses has no idea this is God. But when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, "Moses, Moses." And Moses said, "Here I am." Before God spoke to Moses, Moses moved. Before God revealed to him his purpose in life, his mission to become the deliverer of the nation of Israel from Egyptian bondage, to lead them to the edge of the promised land, God waited to speak to him till he moved. There's a lot of people who say this. They're like, "You know what? I want God to speak to me." You know what? Maybe he's been speaking to you with lots of signs and wonders, but he is waiting for you to move. He is waiting for you to step forward, because he does not speak to Moses until Moses moves. I love the story. You know, you remember the one in New Orleans after Katrina, and remember after the hurricane, people were on top of their houses, and one man was out on top of his house, and a rescue boat came by and said, "You know, do you want to jump in?" And he said, "No, I'm waiting on somebody. I'm waiting on God to save me." And then somebody else came by in a helicopter, and they kind of lowered down near him to rescue him, and he said, "No, go away. I'm waiting on God to save me." And he died. And he went to heaven. And he stood in front of God. And he said, "God, why didn't you save me?" And God said, "I sent a boat. in a helicopter. I mean, you've heard this joke before, right? And you didn't laugh then either. But you understand the point, don't you? Can you imagine Moses going, all right, God, I see a burning bush, but what are you going to speak? Maybe God has been putting burning bushes in your path for a long time, but he's waiting on you to move. He's waiting on you to respond. A lot of people living in Jericho were just sitting in their houses or walking with the crowd, but Zacchaeus got up in a tree. He changed his perspective, and he looked at Jesus, and his life was changed. His life was altered forever as a result of his encounter with him. You got to get the right perspective. You got to stop listening to the wrong people. He moved. And then finally, if we just want to get this wrong, all we got to do is this. Just do not respond correctly. You know, if you want to get it wrong, just don't respond correctly. You say, well, what would be a version of not responding correctly? You know what our number one way that we disobey God in our lives is? We say, God, we're going to do that, but just not now. And then we never get around to it. God, I'm going to do this for you next week, next month, next Sunday, next year. And we never get around to it. When was the opportunity for Bartimaeus' life to be changed? As Jesus walked by. When was the opportunity for Zacchaeus' life to be changed? It was when Jesus was walking by. When was the opportunity for Moses to hear the voice of God from a burning bush? It's when the bush was on fire and he was walking by. What if God is walking by your life today? What if God is walking by your chair today? And what if God is saying to you something, but he's waiting on you to move? He's waiting on you to act. He's waiting on you to respond. And the Bible says it like this in verse 5. Zacchaeus, Jesus said, come down immediately. 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 I must stay at your house today. Not tomorrow, not next week, today. And then afterwards he said, today salvation has come to this house. As Jesus is walking through Jericho, he sees this blind man. We can put the verse on the screen here, or the image here of a artist kind of. The guy can't see. He just hears that Jesus is coming by. I mean, you and I can't see God in this room. We don't see him. Somebody's gonna say, "Well, I don't think God is really here." But this blind man could see him. And this blind man understood this was his chance. This was his opportunity, and he did not want to miss it. And so he'd cry out in the blindness of his vision, but in the visibility of his faith, he would cry out. In Luke 18:35, it says, as Jesus approached Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard the crowd going by, he asked what was happening, and they told him, Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. He called out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. What if God is passing by you today? And he's waiting on you to call out. He's waiting on you to respond. He's waiting on you to move. This verse says that they acted immediately. Immediately. So many times in the Bible, there is a need to respond now. It's kind of like the TV commercials, the advertising. They always say, respond now in the next 30 minutes. You got call in now. And we've kind of gotten numb to that, haven't we? We've kind of gone like, you know what? Everybody's so pushy. Everybody in the sales world so pushy. They want you to make this decision right now. And everybody knows you don't have to make it right now. You can call the next day, and they'll still take your money and still send you that stuff. But what if there is no tomorrow? What if there's no tomorrow for your life? What if today is all you've got and now is the only chance that you'll ever have? What about that? What if God's burning bush moment for you is this moment? And if you don't respond as you should in this moment, you'll never get another moment like it ever again. Notice how Zacchaeus moves in this passage. First, he moves his position. He goes over to a tree. He goes up a tree. He moves physically. Jesus, come to my house. Let's go to his house. And he moves, and he welcomes him into his home. moves all the money out of the way, I guess, so Jesus has somewhere to sit down on the couch or something. He moves in the sense that he ignores the opinions of other people. He moves in the sense that he refuses to listen to the voices of those around him. He moves out of the group think that is our culture that says Christianity is not legitimate. He moves his heart in a way that is profound. He calls Jesus Lord. I mean, minutes earlier, hours earlier, if you said, well, it was the Lord of Zacchaeus' life, it would have been the dollar, as we would call it today. It would have been the coin in his pocket. But he met Jesus, and he has a new Lord. And he acted like Jesus was his Lord. He made Jesus his Lord, and he demonstrated that through his desire to get right with other people and to get right with God. If he's cheated people, he's going to make it right. And then he demonstrates an incredible act of generosity. He's going to give. This is the way that he can make it right for him in this moment. And Jesus tells him that he has immediately been saved. Today, salvation has come to this house. And by the way, to the crowd of people that's standing outside going, what is going on? Jesus says, this is why I've come. It's for Zacchaeus. This is why I've come to seek and to save the lost. Bartimaeus is sitting there beside the road. He's just a beggar. But do you know something? When it comes to salvation, we're all lost before we're saved. And we're all beggars. There's absolutely nothing we can do to save ourselves. We need a Savior. There's no ability that we have, no talent we have, no wealth we have, no human ingenuity that we can devise, no intelligent quotient that is high enough that we can save ourselves. We need to be saved. Somebody said, and I've quoted this earlier in our series, the gospel is one beggar showing another beggar where to find a piece of bread. I'm just somebody who needed to be saved, and God stopped by. And I said, yes, Lord. And he's walking by you today. And whether you realize it or not, you also are no different than anybody else. You either are saved or you need to be. If you're not saved, the Bible says, whether you realize it or not, whether you like this language or not, that you're lost. And you need to be found. The good news is he wants to save you. But you've got to respond. You've got to stop waiting for another burning bush moment, and you've got to say right now, yes, Lord, I want to make you Lord of my life. We're coming to the end of our sermon time here, and we're getting closer to our response time. And today we got two responses. One response is for the person here today who knows they need to make Jesus Lord. They need to be saved. They need to take that step of faith and respond to God. And in just a minute, band's going to come out. We're going to worship. We're going to sing and give you a chance wherever you are to say, you know what? I'm going to take this opportunity today, and I'm going to step out of one of the aisles and just walk down here to the front and choose today to make Jesus Lord. Choose today to begin a life with him. But the other response today is for the people who've already done that, and you're a part of our church, and you know that what we've been trying to do is to create a plan so that more people have a space and a place so that they can be saved. We're trying to save a place for someone to come who's not even here yet. And we're trying to do that by building a parking lot. You can see the video up here. I've been showing it over the last several weeks of our parking area. It's full. It was full this morning. It was full last week. I was surprised on a Sunday when people knew I was going to be asking them to respond financially that anybody showed up at all. So I was kind of delighted today about that. But you know what? We had a parking problem this morning. And it's a great problem to have. It's a good problem, but we want to create a space, and we want to send a message to our community that says we care about you enough that we are making a plan and we're going to make an investment in that. Now, I've explained over the course of the last few weeks that we're told it costs about $2 million to do this, and so we've launched this campaign to do it. You've gotten brochures and information last week. You got a card. If you're in this room and you want one of our response cards, they look like this. Just raise your hand. There's some folks that will hand you one. If you haven't, in a moment after we finish our invitation time, I'm going to give you a chance to come forward if you've not yet already done so and bring your response. And I want to explain to you what this card says and what we're asking you to do today. And if you don't have one, just raise your hand. Someone will give you one. But on this card, you just put your name, your address, your phone number, your email. That way we know that you exist and we can keep in contact with you. But we're asking you to respond in two ways. And the first way is a response that everyone can make. It is a commitment of your own heart to say, okay, God, I'm going to pray for this to be successful. I'm going to pray that God moves in our church in a powerful way so that there is going to be enough financial resources to make it possible for us to build this parking. I mean, just praying for that. You say, well, is that enough? I mean, if that's all you can do, then that's all you can do. But it is something you can do. And wouldn't it be great if all of the people in our church said, we're going to do at least that? And as you pray, be praying about how God would lead you over this next year to give above and beyond your tithe and offering. And I'm not asking you to do something that I haven't already done myself. And I mentioned this last time that as we kind of worked together as a family, kind of figuring that out, we decided to be very generous. And we decided to do it on a weekly basis. And you can see, you can kind of go, oh, I'm going to do it. And in the first service, I told everybody that we did the calculations, and there's 43 weeks left in the month. I think that's right. In the first service, I actually said there was 53. And after the sermon, everybody walked up to me, and instead of saying, hey, preacher, that was a great sermon, they're like, your math is terrible. So I think it's 43, but double check is what's left in this year. But the reason we're doing that as a family, we have 5 kids. We want our children to be able to, Sunday after Sunday, to come to church and to do what we've already done. My wife did this between the services. She said, take this and put it in the offering plate. We've already turned in our commitment card in the first service, and we're writing our first check in this service. But we want our kids to have an opportunity. We want to teach our kids. It's one of the things I just love about having the opportunity to give is to teach my children to be generous. And I got the financial report back this year from our church, our family giving, and to see the children giving weekly, it just brings joy to my heart. I mean, I believe the God of heaven sees that and cares and knows that those gifts they matter, that they're real, and I'm proud to see the next generation taking that on. And I want to challenge you, parents, don't just give for yourself, but teach your children to do this. You're teaching them something that will make a difference in their lives much more profoundly than you probably ever will realize. A lot of things you can give your children, but the gift of teaching them to give is one of the greatest gifts you'll ever teach your children. And what we're asking you to do today is just to fill out one of these, and then after our invitation time, I'll stand up here and I'll invite you to come and we'll make our commitments together. There's these offering plates here. But if you would, stand with me, we're going to pray. And Lord, first of all, God, I just want to pray for you to move mightily and powerfully in our church. You're the God that has all the resources in the universe. And so, Lord, sometimes we come to these moments and we're like, God, why don't you do it? You got all the money. And then we remember Moses at a burning bush and you said, I saw you move. I saw you move. God, we know that right now you're just waiting for our faithfulness. You're waiting for our obedience. You're waiting for our faith to become reality in our life. And God, I just pray that you would move in our church, and I pray that our church would move mightily. But God, I pray also right now for someone here in this room, maybe many people, and those who are watching right now who are hearing this story about how Jesus came to seek and save the lost, and they just realize in this moment, this sermon is about them, and they need to make a decision. And God, the temptation of this moment is to push it off, to say maybe next week or maybe next year, maybe when I get my life all figured out, but it seems like those moments never materialize. And so now, Lord, in this moment, today, would you move Would you move in hearts that would make you Lord, not just of their words, but Lord of life and Lord of action? God, would you move in your church so that we would see it, but so that this world would see it?